Reactive Training Systems.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the RTS podcast. Today we've got myself, Dr. Rory Alter, Mark Robb, and Jim Ellie, and we get to sit around and have a kind of a rolling conversation. We cover a lot of ground. We talk about things like dangerous lifting moments, times where we've almost died in the gym doing various stupid things, how to rate your RPE more accurately. And then we get into talking about injuries and rehab. We talk about rating pain, whether that's a good idea or not, how useful it is, its utility in certain scenarios. We talk about pain science. And then kind of taking it back into more of a non-injured population, we start talking about overcoming fear in training, whether that's related to injury or not. But then we get into talking about personality dimensions, how that relates to training with RPEs, training without RPEs, different ways to train more effectively for people who have different personality types. And then we kind of finish up talking about self-talk and how to use positive self-talk or self-talk in a more broad sense to improve your training outcomes. So before we get into that, I just want to mention a couple things real quick. First, we are going to do another Project Momentum. So this will be the second Project Momentum of the year. This one's going to be more hypertrophy focused. So I don't have exact dates or anything like that to give you just yet, but keep your eyes out open. We'll be trying to come up with that, I would say, later this month, maybe toward the beginning of October. So if you're interested in something more hypertrophy focused, I would ask you to consider joining up with Project Momentum. Also, as always, we have a training log app, a whole suite of web applications, actually. It's for free for anyone to use. It's on the Reactive Training Systems website. You just go to reactivetrainingsystems.com, you log in and click on apps, and you're there. All the applications there are free for anyone to use. There's a training log. There's a athlete monitoring system, a way to monitor your recovery. There's body weight tracking, just a whole list of various apps and ways to customize those apps. And the whole idea is that it helps you to put the right weight on the bar and lift it the right number of times. It's not just a place to write down what you did in your workout. You can do that in a notebook, and it's probably going to be a bit more convenient for you. But if you're interested in actually getting some value out of your training log, if you're interested in finding out what kind of training do you respond best to as an individual, we spend a lot of time in these podcasts and articles and wherever else talking about individual differences in training response. If you want to figure out what you respond best to, then the way that you can start to do that is by collecting your own data and taking a look at that. And we've designed these applications to do that for you, to help you with that process, to help you figure out what is it that you respond best to in training. So the best place to start is just to start wherever you're at now. Start inputting your workouts, start recording those things. You can see your progress. It can help you determine what your working weights should be so that you can, like I said, put the right weight on the bar and lift it the right number of times. Anyway, enough about that. I'll stop talking now and bring you guys the podcast.
Talking about upper lower training.
Density training with the leg press at 7 RM load.
Yeah. So I did that also for close grip incline on the upper day. And like I hadn't really been doing a lot of benching. And I failed. Like I failed with the clips on, I had no spotter. And I felt like I was in high school again. And it was really embarrassing because there's actually two people in the gym that like weren't exactly paying attention, but they knew that I knew what I was doing. So like I don't think they'd assumed I'd fail. And so I have it, on my chest, like I can't get it up.
Did you do the roll down of shame?
Yeah, I did the roll of shame. It was really embarrassing, and I really felt like I didn't know what I was doing anymore.
Now we're going to publish this for everyone to hear. There will be.
I think my bench fails have always been on incline. I don't think that I've ever without a spotter, my bench fails have always been on incline. Except for that one time that I almost died because I didn't have pins and it fell behind my head. That was scary one time.
I think with the incline,
it's generally horrible.
It's difficult because it's like, for me, it's really fast for like the first 4 inches, and then it just, turns off slow.
Yeah,
and so
close grip fails at like right after the sticking point pretty easily. So and fast, like without warning.
Yeah, it was just like, oh, we're done. I was like, what? The last grip felt great.
I almost died on a board press. This was many years ago, but I was benching in a gym by myself. Like no one was there, and I had the pin set, but like a brilliant young man, I had the pin set to a level that would have been appropriate for like a bench to the chest, and I'm doing like a 2 board press, right? Real brilliant move there, but so
I don't think I would have thought of that either. I probably wouldn't have raised the pins.
I want to say that I did think about it, and this is not painting me in a better light at all. Like, I want to say that I did think about it, and I thought, nah, I'm not going to miss, and so I don't make those decisions anymore. So I pressed, missed, bring it back down, set it on the board, and it's like, I knew that I could roll it. Well, I knew I could roll it off the board, and it would hit on the pins, But the thing is, so you've got this 2x4 sitting here on your chest, and you start to roll the bar down the 2x4, and when it gets down to the bottom of the 2x4, it's basically sitting on my solar plexus, and I remember like my whole vision went red. So it popped off the board and landed on the pins before I, blacked out and died. But that's one of those where you go, well, probably should never do that again.
So, seems like it's always heavy tricep involvement when the failure, you're going fine, and then bam, that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like Roy, what you were saying about close grips and then board presses, it just kind of dies all at once when it gets in that range.
Yeah, I think that's the one thing too. People, when they're rating the RPEs, people are just looking at like the top end speed or the easiest part. Some people are like, well, that was easy, especially for the higher rep work, and they're forgetting like it's that really slow part of the movement, the slowest part of the movement where you're going to fail. And if it's something like close grip where you can, it feels fast at the end, you can really easily misjudge if you're not paying attention. I mean, I guess it's more for the people who are newly getting into tracking their RPEs, but that's something.
I don't think it's just that. Like, I totally agree with what you're saying, but I think people that should know better get it wrong quite a lot as well. So I get comments all the time on bench videos that I post, like I'll post a single at an 8 RPE, and the comment I'll get is like, that looked like a 5 RPE, or, if they're not being ridiculous, a 7 RPE. Well, it's not. Like, I know that my bench presses look fast, but if you add a little bit more weight, they just don't go at all. There's a really narrow band in there where you go from, everything looks great to nothing,
Well, I think that's, oh, sorry, go on.
Well, I was just going to say that you can, if you know what you're looking for, you can see it, because it's not just the overall speed of the lift. Like, if you're judging the overall speed of the lift, you've got to know how slow the person can go. But if you're looking at a bit closer and you see kind of how fast those slowest portions are, you're less easily tricked, I think.
You've helped me a lot with my deadlift with that respect, like when I'm like, well, it looks so fast and it felt so fast, but you're like, no, but it was like really slow off the floor. And like we kind of moved from judging my RP from like the overall speed of each rep to just looking at how fast it came off the floor and determining, well, could I break the next one off the floor? Because once I break it off the floor, I think that essentially like every rep looks about the same, but it's just the speed off the floor that changes. So if you look at that slowest portion of the lift, that would help you determine RPE a little bit more. And same thing with squats. You want to look at how hard they struggle at their sticking point, rather than like how fast they locked it out or how fast they came out of the hole. Like, someone can come extremely fast out of the hole and lock it out really fast, but it's getting through that sticking point, you know. And a lot of people have even in terms of injuries, especially with the squat, when people overemphasize the lockout, I'm like, you don't need to overemphasize the lockout, because lockout's the easiest part. It's like getting through that sticking point, you know. So you can't like judge the squat based on how fast you locked it out. You have to judge the squat based on how fast you came through the sticking point.
Right. I remember Brian Siders, he would really jam the lockouts on his squats a lot, you know. So once he would get through the sticking point, he would continue to accelerate all the way up to the top. So,
but there's no reason to do that.
Well, he would squat 1,000 pounds or something like that, and the bar would jump off his back almost at the lockout, you know, and people would see that and go, he's got 100 pounds in the tank. And I mean, granted, he did smoke it, and he probably had, you know, 20, 30, even 50 maybe more in the tank, but, you know, not like, you can't judge the whole lift based on that one, based on the finish, basically.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's a good point as far as your deadlift too. You know, another thing that I look at when we're talking about RPE for your deadlift in particular, since it's so slow off the floor, is basically to see if there's any positional changes that happen before the bar breaks.
Yeah, exactly.
You know?
Like, for instance, on my third deadlift in competition, usually before the bar breaks off the ground, my back starts to round, which you don't see that in training, but we'll see that on a third lift in a competition. And that's because it's really, really hard. So my whole body's moving before the bar actually breaks off the floor. And then it's speed work to the end.
Yeah.
So.
And I mean, it doesn't have to be dramatic either. And for you, with your technical proficiency, I don't think that it is. But it's just like really subtle changes, really subtle
it's like the shoulders coming forward just a little bit.
Right.
That's usually what happens the most, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
There's one little bit about the RPs, and we're talking about it, that I think might be worth talking about, is especially, I think Rory has a lot of experience with this, with the clients she's working with, is like when you're injured, the indicators that you're probably looking at or feeling out to determine your RPE are going to be a lot different than when you're perfectly healthy. And I try to do this a lot for myself, and it's difficult to communicate because I can't tell. I don't, and especially when you're watching someone else's videos, which is why it's kind of frustrating for me when I see other people trying to rate other people's RPEs, you know, because it's like there's so much more than just the speed, and especially when you're injured. I remember when I was, you know, recovering from a few of my pec strains, they would always look easy. Like there isn't even a slow part in the movement, but in that slow, where the slow part normally would be, is where that kind of twinging might happen, or that little slight pain where I'm like, okay, I'm going to just stop here, you know? And that would be my new RPE 10 or RPE 9 or RPE 7, whatever the goal was. It'd be a lot more based on my pain level throughout the movement.
Yeah, when I work with injured athletes, so I feel like I should come up with like an RPE pain scale, but I typically have them give me like an RPE and an RPP pain, like RPP scale. So usually, depending on the injury, I say like cap the load at anything that's like 1 or 2 points above your baseline. So if, like, let's say you walk into the gym and you're having a pain level of 4 out of 10. Okay, so we know that you're starting with a 4 out of 10. So if you're training and everything kind of stays at a 4 out of 10, then we're not making anything worse. If everything starts to feel better, that's a really good sign. The training's helping, the movement's helping. But if we start to get to like RP5 or RP6, I say shut it down. That's your load for the day. Even drop the load from there. It would be interesting. I feel like Mike and I should sit down and talk about like developing an RPP scale for training that isn't just like, that kind of correlates with load a little bit more. I don't know. But.
Yeah, you know, a couple things on that. So when I was dealing more directly with my injury, I attempted it, and it's a tough problem to solve, because what we've done with you know, normal RPEs is kind of benchmarked it off of a maximum effort, a 10 RPE, and just kind of extrapolated it from there. It's really difficult to benchmark a perception of pain. And it might be that you start at the other end of the scale, a pain level of 0, you know, but then where do you go from there is not totally clear, you know, and how to, you know, put adequate descriptions on those different pain levels is not so easy. Like, I don't even think the smiley faces at the doctor's office are so easy, right? Like, I mean, I get the concept of what you're trying to do.
They have like visual analog scales. They have all different like types. So there's the smiley faces, but then there's like tally marks. So I think tally marks would probably be better for you. Like, well, no emotional connection to pain.
Man, so then we're going to have different RPE scales for different personality types too.
Oh, Jesus.
Yeah, I don't see how this could possibly go wrong. You know, another thing that we had mentioned, Rory, when you and I were talking before, this idea of rating your pain, that is not a thing that you would want to do in a normal situation. Like, if you're not dealing with an injury, or you're just in a day-to-day normal baseline scenario, don't do that. You know, like, you don't want to pay more attention to it than is required, basically.
Yeah, exactly. But I feel like, even for you, I feel like you created your own pain scale when we were working more closely on your injuries. Like, I really feel that you were using like 1 through 4.
Well, yeah, because I don't like to go past that.
Yeah, well, right. So then, but then the scaling has, you know, as you have to look at it at a little bit of a different scale, because 1 through 4, if you're having 2, that's like 50% pain level for you, versus if a 50% pain level for someone else would be a 5 on the 0 to 10 scale, you know? So your perception of your pain was on a smaller scale, but if I correlated it to a scale out of 10, then it was like pretty significant, you know? So you have to kind of look at, you know, what scale the person is using.
You know, there's some different ways to quantify that, and hopefully I'm not venturing too far off into nerd land here, but whatever.
It's okay. Yeah. Venture off.
people can skip this part if they don't like it. So there's scales like the RPE scale, which is fairly consistent from one person to the next, and we use a maximum effort as a benchmark and things like that. But then there are other ways of doing the scaling. For example, in the track test, there are, I think for most of the questions, there are 5 choices, right? And you get a description, but in the background, basically how the system works, and that's not going to be obvious to, you know, just a surface level user. There are numbers attached to each of those descriptions. Now, we could compare those numbers to an absolute scale the same way that we do an RPE scale, but one problem that we've seen with that is that people have a different baseline, and this is exactly what you're talking about as far as me, you know, staying in the 0 to 4 range on my pain ratings, whereas other people are you know, rating more broadly. If you have somebody who's kind of doing that, staying more on one end of the scale, for them, you know, a change outside of that normal is a major indicator, you know. So there are ways to you know, analyze those numbers so that you can appreciate, you know, looking at the Z-score, you know, how many standard deviations from the average they are, you know. So if their average rating of tiredness works out to be a 3, you know, then for them to go outside of that average is a bigger indicator than somebody who's much more variable on a normal basis. So I'm not sure that I explained that very adequately, but it's difficult to put statistics into words sometimes. But
no, you did.
There goes.
Although I'm not a statistician.
But yeah, just to say that I think there's a lot of different ways to rate it, and a lot of different ways to analyze the ratings. The question is, you know, how can we do that in a way that's, you know, easily usable for normal people, you know?
Yeah. Like maybe relatively consistent.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
That'll be
the
fun
next
to
project.
Create, yeah. Maybe like it'd be cool to team up with a bunch of like pain scientists you know, like people who just, I mean, I guess, I don't know, Roy, if you'd call yourself like a pain,
No,
you know, expert.
No, I'm not a pain expert. No, really, I'm not a pain expert. There's a ton of pain science work out there that I really need to explore more. It's pretty interesting stuff, but I think that, you know, understanding that there's like more than one component to pain than just the physical aspect of pain. There's the emotional connection, there's the person's perception, there's the person's past experiences and future experiences, willingness to get better, all that kind of stuff. What your central nervous system is doing in terms of the length of time you've been in pain. And this is something that I've talked to Mike about before, and you know, Jim and Mark, I've probably talked to the lifters of yours that I've worked with. The longer you've been in pain and the longer you've been out of training at maximum ability, the longer it takes to return to like baseline or normal levels, you know. But there, you know, moving from this like acute to chronic pain phase and then beyond chronic, you know, like there's, you know, the 4 to 6 weeks, and then like 6 weeks to like 3 months. That's like your like initial like chronic phase, but then you have your like long-term chronic pain that's beyond there. If you don't really kind of get ahead of that pain before it becomes like long-term chronic, then you've got these pathways in your nervous system developing that kind of like stay, you know. So, but I mean, like really, there's so much pain science out there that I'm not up to date on that I definitely need to be. I think it's like such an interesting field. It's, you know, especially in rehab.
There was this like huge seminar that was taking place, I think in April at Ohio State. I really wanted to check it out, but I happened to be doing some work with 9 for 9. And it was all about how we focus, like, so the shift has been from, okay, biomechanical doesn't matter. Like, not that that's true, but like people like, you know, it doesn't matter how your posture is. It doesn't matter about this movement. It doesn't matter about any of that. So everyone's kind of shifting the social, psychosocial model. You know, that's all we need to focus on. If we just, and I kind of got a little bit more in that headspace too, where you just talk about your injuries in more of a positive light, using the positive connotation with everything, you know, and you say not thinking about your pain while you're not in the gym. And we kind of, a lot of people just shifted in that direction almost entirely, without even addressing the biomechanical part of how pain works. And I'm still working on figuring out how to, in my head, you know, for myself, integrating all three aspects of the biosocial, was it the biosocial psycho model?
Biopsychosocial,
yeah.
No, I mean, that's definitely true. You know, as even, and like, I feel like I always tie in any podcast that I do, I always tie into that one article that I wrote, treat the issue, not the tissue. But it's true. It's like you can't just treat the psychological components or the neurological components of pain. You can treat them, but if you never take away the causation of the pain, that pathway is likely to remain there, because you go back to training with the same technique or biomechanical model that you used before, and then you re-injure or re-aggravate the area that was injured before. So if you don't treat all things together, then you're not going to get as far as you could without treating all of them together. So not to negate the importance of soft tissue work, you know, like I definitely, like if I have someone come into my office, we talk about, you know, I take the whole history. I ask a lot about their life, their training history, like what they enjoy, what their goals are. Okay, you really want to focus on the patient, or the client. You want to know what they want, how they're invested in their rehabilitation, because you can have an idea of how you would treat them, but if that idea doesn't work into their model and then slowly work their model into your model, then it's never going to work. So typically, like the way that I focus on treating an injured client, like in the office or in my practice, is there's always going to be soft tissue work, because it gives them comfort. It gives them temporary pain relief. They feel comfortable with my touch. They feel comfortable with how I'm handling them. And then we move into the movement component of the rehab session. Slowly over the course of our treatment sessions, we do less on the table and more with the barbell. And throughout all of that, we have discussions about what's going on in their life, how they're focusing on their rehab, how they think about their pain, changing their thought process about pain. Even, I don't want to name the client that I'm working with currently, but one of the RTS clients that I'm working with actually lives in New York City, so he comes to see me on the weekends. He had a pec tear like a year and a half ago, and he has a tremendous amount of fear of he's had it repaired. It's totally completely healed. He can bench press, not heavy, but he can bench press, but he's terrified of it re-tearing. So he kind of, anything that he feels in his shoulder and his pec, he's like, I gotta lower the load. And then one day he came in and he's like, just be honest with me. Do you think that I'm being like chicken over here? And I'm like, yeah, I think that you're a little scared, but I think that it's normal to be scared because you had a trauma, you know? So you have a little bit of PTSD, which I didn't say, but like, you can imagine like someone like tearing your quad or tearing your pec while you're squatting or while you're bench pressing, and then coming back and doing that same thing that caused such a severe injury that blew you out. You needed a surgery, you know, you needed to go through 6 or 8 months of rehab to get back to normal. You know, there's that whole psychological component, and you know, you have to ease into addressing the psychological components of pain or fear or rehab blocks to rehab. You know, you can't just say like, listen, I think you're being a chicken, like, let's stop being scared of your pec here. Like, we got to bench press. You can't just do that, because then they're not going to, I mean, maybe it depends on the person, but you have to read the person really well. So there's, you know, multiple aspects of rehabilitating and decreasing pain. So there's the, we just talked about it, the biomechanical, the tissue, the psychological. And like, I feel like in physical, actual office rehab settings, I feel like I'm more of a psychologist than I am a rehab specialist on a regular basis, because there's so many psychological components that go into pain or dysfunction.
I would imagine that there's a significant amount of complexity that arises from that too, that, you know, there are these 3 different branches that we've been talking about, but there's a dynamic interplay between them, you know, that it's not a stretch, I think, for most people to understand how, you know, the psychological is going to affect pain outcomes, or the psychological can affect, you know, other things. But I would guess that, you know, if you have someone with back pain and improving their posture is beneficial to that's going to have psychological, like a positive psychological implication as well. So it's not just one branch at a time or one branch in isolation, that one is necessarily affecting the other 2.
Well, it's interesting. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say I can relate totally to what you were saying earlier about, you know, the client with the pec strain. I ruptured several discs, or a couple of discs, and had pain basically constantly for over 5 years. It was unbelievable. I mean, I couldn't do anything, and did that basically deadlifting 500 pounds. And so when I finally got back to training, got back to 500 pounds, it's like, oh no, you know, this is what put me into pain for 5 years. Laying here on the floor right now, and took a little mental gyrations to kind of, you know, get myself through that. But then once I got over 500, then it was like, you know, free clear road back up to 600 or whatever. So
yeah, I mean, that's definitely true. You know, when I evaluate clients who are injured, I always ask them like, what's their best lift for the injured lift. I usually just ask them what their best lifts are, just to have a general understanding of their overall strength. But you always do want to know like where they were in terms of the load that they were at when they were injured. But so not all the injuries are related to lifting, but a lot of injuries do affect lifting. So particularly though, when the person gets injured lifting, that's when I think that there's a little bit more of a psychological component, because there's always going to be that fear at that weight or around that weight that like, oh shit, last time I did this weight, it like took me out for 6 months, you know? So typically I like to keep a client on board for physical therapy or remote rehab until they've exceeded that injury level load, because once we can get past that, we know that we've kind of cleared all the hurdles in terms of the psychological component of approaching that load and the physical components of approaching that load. And then really after that, if I feel like they're clear in terms of their movement patterns and their understanding of how to program efficiently for protecting themselves going forward, and if they feel comfortable, then I say like, listen, you are more than welcome to, you know, do this on your own, and I'll always be here. And I always, you know, you like want to follow up in 4 weeks always, just to make sure that everything goes smoothly. But yeah, get that benchmark, you know, if you can get past that hurdle, then you know that you kind of tackled the physical and the psychological components of the pain or the injury, the pre-pain or the injury.
Personally, I think oh, sorry, go ahead, Mark.
Well, I was just going to say, I think the interesting thing to me with that too is that I think people tend to put that boundary on their max weights. You know, in other words, they know what weight they were using when they got injured, and they know what their max weights are, and they sort of tend to treat them both. In other words, if you're fearful of a weight that hurts you,
Mm-hmm.
and you tend to be fearful of a max weight, or what you believe is your max weight. In other words, if you believe that's your max weight, it probably is your max weight.
Mm-hmm. Well, so that's interesting that you say that, because, and I'm going to take this in a little bit of a different direction now, but I've noticed in my own training, like I kind of feel that I like inhibit myself from going forward sometimes. And last night I was like, I don't give a crap. I'm squatting 325 for 3. And I think I did that last week too. I was like, remember we had that conversation? You're like, what did you have in mind for today? I was like 315, but everything felt like awful leading up to 315. And you're like, no one gives a crap, like whatever. So I was just like, you know, you have to just stop being scared of so this is like in the non-injured individual. You have to stop being scared of uncharted territories. Otherwise, you're going to be your own worst enemy and holding yourself back. And I think the same is true for injuries, although not to the same extent, because you need to take note of what your current status is in terms of your injury. If you've been pain-free, you've been training with minimal to no pain, you've been progressing, your lifts look good, and your overall quality of life has improved, and you don't come home from a training session with more pain, then I would say not stop being, but try not to be afraid of taking the next step. But if you're still in pain and your levels haven't really subsided that much, like be wary of going forward, you know?
I think there's a lot of personality that goes into basically all of this. And this is something that I want to get more clear on, because I think we have a lot of guesses at this point, or at least in the world that I live in, it seems like it's a lot of guesses. And I'd like to get something a bit more concrete. But I think there's a certain personality dimension or a certain personality component that causes some people to hold back a little bit more. And if you're in that situation, then yeah, we need to kind of be a bit less cautious intentionally. So, you know, Rory, like I think you're a good example of that. Like you go to the gym and you're warming up and things feel heavy, and it's like, well, I know, but let's just get it done, you know? And sometimes that's the appropriate answer, but then other times you have somebody and you need to take those signals a bit more at face value, I guess I would say. And I do for sure think that there's a personality component to that. I'm not sure exactly what it is yet, but It seems like
what's the personality trait that correlates with anxiety?
Neuroticism. So
am I highly neurotic?
I think when you tested, yeah, you were higher. I mean, not like ridiculous, but higher than most of the other people.
Yeah, I mean that would. I think that's to be honest. Like for me, that's what I think when I have this like story in my head when I'm training. You know, like, what if I fail? You know, I play out a story in my head, like, it's going to be really hard. I don't think I can do it. And when I change that story, which is a common theme in terms, because I think that, was it on this podcast that I talked about my anxiety?
I don't think so.
Well, I mean, there was some, anyway, I have diagnosed anxiety disorder, and I create stories that haven't played out in my head yet. And those stories that I've created inhibit me from doing what I want to do or what I need to do. And when I change the story, then I'm able to change my actions or create the action that I want to happen. So I think that what's happened the past, the past 2 weeks is that I've changed that story in my head, Yeah. So I would say that the only thing that holds me back is my anxiety in terms of like missing a lift or not being able to do it, or it being an RP 10 and not being the RP 9 that it was supposed to be. So that's just me creating the stories in my head. So maybe if a person's like higher anxiety or high neuroticism, maybe that correlates that. And that's just me kind of drawing this from my own what I feel my own personality limitations might be towards training.
I think I have a few things I want to say, but the first thing is that when Mark just talked about how he was in pain, I think this story I'm about to tell has been applicable like in a lot of different places in my life. But the first one, Mark's saying that he's had a situation where he was in pain for 5 years because of his back. Something that's always helped me in almost every way is knowing that someone has basically experienced something that I have and that they've been able to get better. Because I think especially with those stories you're talking about, Rory, it's easy to think you're the only one that's ever gone through this experience, and that like you have so much of the burden to fix it. And it's like, no one's ever done this before. I'm the only one. No one's ever squatted 325. This is crazy. How is this going to happen? And for me, I think I do that too. You try to isolate yourself because you don't want to mess. Well, maybe not everyone, but I don't want to always expose everyone else to my problems, but to know other people are going through similar issues and similar struggles, it really helps me personally to prove to my brain that I don't have to.
No, I think you're definitely right. And even when Mike and I were working more closely on his injury, I was like, I think that you need to like put this out there, because people need to know that they're not the only one who's struggling, and who have gone through injuries. And, you take this like world-renowned lifter and all of a sudden you break him down and you say, oh shit, he's a real person and he experiences like real things that other people go through. And then you realize that you're not alone. The other person reading realizes that they're not alone in terms of, whatever their injury might be. And I think that also plays into the obviously the psychological components of injury.
Rory, you were talking about anxiety and changing the story in your mind. And I wanted to add something to that. Not that I'm a psychotherapist or anything, but what you're describing is kind of it's cognitive behavioral therapy.
Yeah, I see a therapist. Well, actually, she's out on maternity leave right now. But I do see a therapist who practices cognitive behavioral therapy with me. I've probably been seeing her for like 2 years. And so it's been interesting. It's been extremely helpful.
That's very cool, actually. Yeah. I didn't know that. So,
and there's another one, there's ABT. I forget what the A stands for, but it's another type of behavioral therapy that she's not certified in, but works really good for like eating disorders and anxiety and all that stuff. So
I see.
But yeah, go on. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, it's fine. The other component to that I was kind of piecing together before we started this, I was listening to some of the audio that Greg Nuckols and Eric Helms and Mike Zordos do for mass. And they were discussing a study where, let's see if I remember some of the details, but there were two groups. One group did training only. Another group did training with basically a cognitive behavioral therapy kind of approach between sets. So like they would try to capture whatever sorts of self-talk that you have, negative self-talk that you have between sets, and change that story so that it's something positive, and then repeat those positive stories for however long the rest periods were between sets. And that led to I forget what the exact numbers were, and you could no doubt look it up, but it was a substantial improvement in the amount of strength that you were able to gain over the course of 8 weeks or so the study ran for. And I think that's fascinating, right? Because it's something that's relatively easy to do. It doesn't cost anything. You just take note of, hey, what am I thinking about that's not positive, and how can I change that around to something that, and so to go off on a little tangent here, anytime you start talking about positive self-talk or positive imagery, there are inevitably people who say that they don't do well with that, and they prefer the haters and the negative self-talk, right?
Side note, I think what I told myself was no one gives a fuck. So I don't know if that's positive or negative.
That's what I'm saying, right? Like I would. So I do something similar, but like, what's the message? Like, so you can phrase it in a tough guy kind of way, right? But what's the message there is that your concerns don't need acknowledgement right now. What you need right now is to lift this weight. Yeah. Now you could say it like that, or you could say no one gives a fuck,
Which is much shorter, much concise, I guess is the point.
Right. And there's probably an emotional trigger in that. And so, yeah, I mean, do whatever, like phrase it however you need to phrase it, to get the message across. But the idea is it seems to me a similar idea in almost all cases.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think I made a post about that a while ago. How just, when you're listening to people in the gym and they're hyping each other up or they're not hyping each other up, or especially at competition, sometimes it's just really almost just offensive to listen to the things that people are telling their clients and their athletes to like hype them up. And it's like, in my mind, because I really, really do not respond well to any type of negative,
you don't want me to slap you in the face at a competition with like tons of chalk?
I really respond well to back slaps, but just one. Just do one. I only need one. But also very much like a positive feedback for me is helpful, because in my mind, if someone tells me, stop being, a little insert expletive here for me to get hyped up for a squat, the negative to that is that if I fail the lift, then I am whatever they just told me I was going to be if I failed. If I fail a lift,
reinforcement.
If I fail a lift and they say, you got this, the worst case in my head is, okay, I didn't. You were wrong. It was just a miscalculation.
No, but see, I also think that like when I create these stories in my head, like I have to, and I think Paulie talked about this one time. I forget how he kind of like discussed his approach to the like platform, but like worst case scenario is you miss the lift. I mean, listen, there are other worst case scenarios, but we don't have to go there, because has that ever happened to you? Sure. But I think for the injured person, the worst case scenario is they get injured again. And that's going to be like a huge fear for someone. But the worst case scenario for you in a competition is you miss the lift. But just don't miss the lift. I don't know. Sorry, that went nowhere. My thought went nowhere. There's actually like a ton of worst case scenarios. Like you could get fourth instead of second or something like that, but you won't die is my point.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Mike. I was just going to say, off of what Jim just said there, that kind of goes back to personality too. Like other people's, what they're saying to you, either negative or positive, whatever. It's up to your personality whether you want to own that or not. In other words, if they say, "Oh, you're a whatever," if you're chicken shit if you don't make this lift or whatever, and then you don't make the lift, well, it's up to you whether you feel like, yeah, I'm really chicken shit, or oh, they're full of crap, I shouldn't listen to them in the first place.
Well, I would say that the people that respond best to that probably don't think about it much at all. That they missed the lift, and they're probably not that focused on the things that were said, but more the energy that was that you fed off the energy that was there prior to the lift rather than the actual things that were said. But I agree with you that there's probably a personality distinction that's in there. Now, whether that's a fixed thing or not, I don't know, but different people are going to find different ways of stating the thing, either motivating or not. But I think at the end of the day, we're kind of moving the same direction in terms of the overall message.
I think though that, like Jim was saying, he in terms of where he's observing this, it's with other coaches or other handlers and other lifters, and I come across this with the clients that I work with on a regular basis in terms of programming or training or whatever. Oh my God, that person squatted so bad. Like, I wanted to say something to them in the gym. I can't believe their coach was teaching them how to squat like that or bench like that. I'm like, don't worry about other people. They have their coach, you have your coach, mind your own business, And I think that on the platform, on meet day, like, you're going to be paired with the coach that works best for you. Like, you wouldn't be working with the coach if your personalities and your methodologies and ways of working together didn't work, So put your blinders on meet day, focus on you and what you need to hear for yourself to complete the lift, and don't worry about anybody else, because who gives a crap? No one gives a shit.
Yeah, but my point was that just kind of all goes back to, this all kind of ties back to the personality stuff. I don't think that's, you can't escape that. Like the agreeableness aspect, and giving a shit what other people think. Some people really don't give a shit what other people think, and some people really do.
That's true. I hadn't thought about it from a perspective of agreeableness, but yeah, I mean, some people needs not the best choice of word, but certainly crave more of the social affirmation. Yeah. And other people really thrive off of a more competitive sort of environment. I definitely see this among different business owners. Like, some people are highly cooperative, and then other people are totally the opposite of that. And I mean, it's obviously the same thing with any sort of athlete as well. I think powerlifting just has a more of a cultural atmosphere of cooperation as opposed to other sports. I mean, you think of a combat sport where you're literally fighting someone. I think it would be a weird scenario to go into that and being like, I really want the best for that person. Like, how do you do that? Well, I don't think you can. So,
oh my God, I'm getting in my competitive mindset now. I'm like, I hope they all miss their lifts.
I think, oh man, you had a really good way to end it, and I just hate that my mind just keeps thinking. But there's, I think, a little bit more, maybe just to the personality than maybe your agreeableness, and maybe this is how your personality develops over time. But I know for me that one of the main reasons why I respond really well to positive reinforcement, positive feedback, is because of what the negative feedback meant for me when I was growing up, I guess, and like what these words and how the way people are saying things, how that impacted me in certain social situations, and like what that person that was saying something like that how I felt about them. And there's, I mean, I know this. I know this is how I feel. Otherwise, I wouldn't care. You know, like if I never had anyone, you know, bully me or whatever, it wouldn't matter. I'd be like, well, yeah, who cares? Everyone talks like this. You know what I mean?
Well, and I don't mean to discount any of that, because those life experiences and all that stuff, that gets internalized and it does affect your personality. Some personality dimensions turn out to be a bit more malleable than others. But absolutely, those things will affect your outlook. And so we've been talking about personality through the lens of, you know, big 5 personality traits. And that's just kind of because that's what I've learned the most about. And that's because, as far as I understand, it's the most scientifically valid approach to measuring personality. But there's a lot more to it than just 5 parameters, you know, and each of those 5 parameters break off into subparameters. But then there are probably other aspects as well, you know, those might be the main ones. But then life experience and stuff like that is going to factor into it as well. What
about astrology? I'm a Gemini.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely astrology.
Oh, wait. No, you're not a Gemini.
We're going to get a lot of hate comments now. That
Jim, what are you? Astrology. Jim, are you a Gemini?
No, I'm a Virgo.
Virgo.
Which apparently is very accurate from what I've heard, you know. Apparently my personality really lines up.
Mine too. I'm always like hot and cold, like good and bad. Can't make a decision.
There we go. So we dumped on astrology, and then we just kind of proved that it's a valid tool between you two, right? Those two.
So now
we need to correlate people's signs with their training programs.
Oh my god. Oh man.
Oh, I'm funny. No, I'm just kidding.
That's my first email to, you know, the first email now to my clients is going to be, so I hear you're a Gemini.
Oh god.
Pair people with coaches based on astrology sign. Anyway, so this conversation is devolving rather rapidly. Maybe we ought to just wrap it up here.
Oh god.
Yeah. So anyway, that's where we're gonna say enough is enough for today. But thanks, guys, for hanging out and chatting about RPE, injury, pain levels, personality, and
astrology.
We covered a lot of ground here. But thanks, guys, for hanging out and chatting with me and lending your expertise. Thanks, everyone, for listening. We'll see you guys next time.
Reactive Training Systems.